You're just a freeloading grunt living off tax dollars. Crawl back to your raggedy barracks and don't you dare shame the Blackwell family name with that reeking uniform. My father's contempt crashed down on me right outside the north gate of the White House. He tilted his chin up, waving his gold-plated VIP ticket, looking at me with ruthless eyes like I was a pile of garbage. Behind him, my brother and sister-in-law smirked, waiting for my humiliating collapse. But I didn't shed a single tear. I silently stepped up to the security checkpoint and pulled a matte red military ID from my jacket. As the laser scanner swept across it, the system screen instantly flashed a blood-red alert. The female Secret Service agent turned pale, completely drained of blood. Instantly, all 24 heavily armed Secret Service agents shifted their stances, standing at strict attention and saluting me in unison. But the thing that made my father's smile die, his complexion evaporating entirely, was the moment the most powerful four-star admiral in the Pentagon personally ran over, raised his hand in a salute, and uttered 4 terrifying words. Before I tell you what those 4 words were and how this night truly ended, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Don't go anywhere, because to understand this glorious downfall we have to go back exactly 1 week. Exactly 1 week before that fateful night at the White House gates, the glaring light from the massive crystal chandelier in my father's Georgetown mansion reflected off the roasted pheasant placed dead center on the table. The opulent dining room was essentially a battlefield, cleverly disguised as a high society celebration. I sat perfectly still, maintaining a rigid, upright posture, my hands resting calmly on my lap, my back pressed flat against the chair so I could monitor every exit in the room. An old habit from the field, the heavy scent of roasted pheasant and expensive scotch hung in the air like a fog of privilege. My mother, Catherine, sat directly across from me, and from the moment I had walked through the front door an hour earlier, she had not once looked in my direction, not a single greeting. Not a glance. She adjusted the napkin on her lap, sipped her wine, and kept her eyes locked on my brother as though he were the only child she had ever produced. That silence cut deeper than any insult she could have spoken out loud. My brother Bradley leaned back heavily into his plush velvet dining chair, lazily swirling a pour of ridiculously expensive scotch in a heavy crystal tumbler. He looked around the room like a man who had just swallowed the entire world whole. "The ink is practically dry," Bradley declared, flashing a sickeningly arrogant smile as he took a sip of his liquor. $500 million. The Department of Defense is handing Project Sentinel to us. He set the glass down hard on the mahogany, and the amber liquid trembled inside the crystal. Jasmine, his wife, clapped her manicured hands in absolute ecstasy. The massive diamond rings on her fingers caught the chandelier's light, blinding and ostentatious, throwing tiny flashes of light across the ceiling like cheap fireworks. "This changes everything," she screeched, her voice grating against my ears like fingernails on a chalkboard. "We are locking in the Aspen real estate. Bradley cannot fly commercial anymore. It's disgusting sharing air with poor people." She leaned into Bradley's shoulder, rubbing his arm with her jeweled fingers, already spending money that belonged to the American taxpayer. I kept my face locked in an emotionless military mask, blinking slowly. My pulse sat at a steady 58 beats per minute. They were completely unaware that Project Sentinel was the military's new highly classified encrypted communications network, and I was the final reviewing officer holding the ultimate veto pen. Every word they spoke at that table was handing me the ammunition I needed to destroy them. My father, Richard, sliced his pheasant meat with cold, mechanical precision, the silver knife scraping sharply against the fine china. Each cut was deliberate, aggressive, like a man carving territory. "That is vision," he stated, pointing his knife directly at Bradley's chest. "Knowing exactly whose hand to grease. Project Sentinel is ours." The arrogance in his voice was thick enough to choke on. He lifted his chin and scanned the room, making sure every staff member in earshot understood the magnitude of the Blackwell Empire's latest conquest. Jasmine then turned her crosshairs on me, eyeing my practical, tailored civilian attire with pure, unfiltered disgust. She actually crinkled her nose as if she were smelling raw garbage rotting in the sun. She looked me up and down slowly, from my simple leather watch to my flat-soled boots, cataloging every piece of clothing that didn't have a designer label on it. "How is it Alex still fixing computers for those old men at the Pentagon?" Look at your rigid cheap soldier outfit, it reeks of the sweat of low-level grunts. I didn't flinch a single muscle. My intensive training allowed me to endure psychological interrogation techniques far worse than a vain socialite's petty insults. I had sat in rooms where enemy combatants screamed threats of death 2 inches from my face, and I did not blink. I calmly picked up my heavy crystal water goblet, took a measured sip, and set it down onto the coaster without making a single sound. I am a military cyber-analysis expert, Jasmine. I stated evenly, my voice completely devoid of emotion, my eyes locking onto hers, until she awkwardly looked away and busied herself adjusting the massive gemstone necklace resting against her spray-tanned collarbone. Bradley scoffed loudly, the sound echoing in the dining room as he smoothed the crisp crease of his custom-tailored silk shirt to emphasize his immense wealth. Just a fancy word for desk jockeys. He mocked, setting his scotch down and leaning forward with a predatory grin. What do they pay you? 60 grand a year. I pay taxes to fund your salary, you poor grunt. I spend that much just to buy a watch. He dramatically lifted his wrist, flashing a gold timepiece that cost more than most people's homes. He rotated it slowly under the chandelier light, making absolutely sure I could see every diamond-encrusted number on the dial. My mother mercilessly stabbed a piece of asparagus with her fork, looking at me with undisguised bitter disappointment. The same woman who carried me for 9 months, who nursed me as an infant, now stared at me like I was a stain on the family china. She is the disgrace of the bloodline, Catherine added, chewing her food, slowly savoring the cruelty of her own words. Hiding in the military to escape real competition. She washed the sentence down with a long sip of Cabernet, never breaking the dismissive, icy glare fixed on my face. They relentlessly mocked my uniform, my rank, and my ideals. They worshipped dirty money, fully believing it could eclipse honor, duty, and the law. Every venomous word they threw at me across that dinner table was meant to humiliate, to break my spirit, and to assert their absolute financial dominance over my life. The roasted pheasant grew cold on the fine china. The scotch kept flowing, and their mouths kept running, digging graves they could not see. I let their relentless insults wash over me, refusing to offer a single word of defense or justification. I didn't argue with them. I didn't explain the heavy weight of my rank or the immense power of my top-secret clearance level. Instead, I simply mapped their psychological weaknesses. Their blinding overconfidence was a catastrophic tactical error they were committing repeatedly right in front of me. I carefully placed my linen napkin on the table, folding it into a perfect, precise square, aligning the edges flawlessly. Every single word they spoke was systematically digging their own graves deeper into the dirt. I shifted my weight slightly in my chair, preparing my mind for the actual assault I knew was coming next. I scanned the room for exits, noting the placement of the staff and the layout of the mansion, observing their relaxed, triumphant body language. They genuinely thought they were the apex predators at this table, chewing me up for sport, but they were entirely blind to the invisible board we were actually playing on. My training taught me a simple principle. The loudest person in the room is the weakest, and this room was deafening. I noticed the domestic staff hovering near the kitchen entrance, their faces carefully blank, their eyes darting between my father and me. They had seen this theater before. They knew which side of this table had the real power, even if my family did not. The dinner dragged on painfully, their toxic, biting words striking like needles against my psychological armor. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. My father slammed his heavy hand down onto the wood, rattling the crystal and the silverware. He reached beneath his chair and pulled out a thick document securely bound in a blue legal folder. He tossed it aggressively across the polished mahogany table. It slid rapidly and stopped dead right in front of my porcelain plate. I stared at the bold print on the cover page. It was a property transfer deed. My grandfather's historic New York estate, the brownstone he built with his bare hands in 1952, the only asset he left exclusively in my name when he passed. The very last and only piece of my identity that this family had not contaminated with their greed. "Sign it," Richard ordered coldly, aggressively tapping his index finger on the hard wood of the table. "You contribute nothing to this family. Now is the time for you to be useful." I slowly looked up from the document, my gaze piercing straight through his polished corporate facade. "Why do you need the assets of a freeloading grunt when you just bragged about a $500 million contract?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly flat. The question hung in the air. Jasmine stopped chewing. Bradley stopped smirking. Bradley immediately leaned forward, his arrogant, self-satisfied smile completely vanishing from his face, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. "You don't understand business, Alex," he lectured, resting his elbows on the table with the condescending posture of a man explaining gravity to a toddler. "We need clean, untraceable collateral to secure a massive offshore transfer. We need it to grease the wheels with international partners to lock down Project Sentinel." I tilted my head slightly to the left, rapidly calculating the exact devastating legal magnitude of his words in my head. The fool had just confessed to money laundering and bribery in front of 5 people and an entire domestic staff. "You are talking about federal bribery," I stated, my voice completely deadpan, letting the accusation hang in the air like a guillotine blade suspended by a thread. Jasmine hissed from across the table, her eyes glowing with ravenous, uncontrolled greed. "It's a support fee," she screeched defensively, waving her diamond-clad hand in the air like the gems would somehow make the crime legal. "You need to be reasonable. It's just a temporary transfer. The president will announce it next week at the White House." I sat perfectly still, regulating my breathing to a slow, methodical rhythm. My pulse had not moved a single beat above 60. "You want me to sacrifice my inheritance to fund your federal crimes?" I asked, staring her down until the color drained from her spray-tanned cheeks. My absolute unwavering composure immediately triggered Bradley's explosive, uncontrolled rage. The high-powered lawyer slammed his closed fist down onto the table so hard that ice water splashed violently from the crystal goblets, soaking into the fine linen tablecloth. A shard of ice skittered across the mahogany and fell to the hardwood floor. "You don't have the right to say no," he roared, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging like ropes under the skin. "I am a senior partner. I will use every connection in Washington to strip your military status. I will frame you and throw you to a court-martial. I will make sure you are kicked out of the military, with a stained record, and starve on the streets." The pressure in the dining room became instantly suffocating. They leaned in, surrounding me with their malice, their faces twisted with rage and entitlement. My mother gripped the stem of her wineglass so hard her knuckles turned white. My father's jaw locked tight, the muscles in his temple pulsing. They genuinely believed a lifetime of deep psychological manipulation had broken my will, and that screaming, empty legal threats would instantly force me into trembling submission. They had absolutely no idea who they were facing across that table. Underneath the table, hidden from their sight, I subtly slid my index finger over the bezel of my smartwatch, a classified, highly restricted intelligence device issued only to elite operatives. A rapid micro-vibration against my wrist confirmed the recording and transmission system was fully active. Every single thread of ruin, every piece of confessed bribery evidence, every vile insult was silently transmitting directly to the Cyber Command secure servers in real time. I had been recording since the moment I sat down. I slowly reached out and picked up the expensive fountain pen they had thrown at me. I gripped it tightly in my hand, rolled it between my fingers, once looked my father and brother dead in their eyes, and slammed the pen down onto the table with a sharp, dry crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. "I refuse," I stated with nerves of forged steel, my voice cutting through their noise with lethal precision. "I would rather serve this country than enable those who sell it out." The massive dining room plunged into a dead, suffocating silence for a few seconds before the real fury erupted. My absolute, unflinching rejection had completely punctured their massive, fragile egos. My father forcefully pushed himself back from the table, the chair legs screaming against the hardwood. His face twisted in pure, unadulterated malice. Without breaking eye contact, he marched over to the concealed wall safe hidden behind an oil painting of my grandfather, the very man whose estate they were trying to steal. He punched in the code with aggressive jabs, swung the heavy steel door open, and retrieved 4 thick, cream-colored envelopes, heavily embossed with the gleaming presidential seal. "Do you know what these are?" Richard growled, marching back and holding them up to the chandelier's light as if they were holy relics. "VIP tickets to the White House state dinner next week. We will sit next to the generals to receive our glory. There were supposed to be 5 tickets. I was going to bring you so you could taste power, but you don't deserve it." He violently threw the fifth ticket onto the wooden table with a sneer of utter, unapologetic contempt. It slid across the polished surface and hit my water glass with a soft tap. Your rigid, cheap uniform would shame me at the banquet table. The admirals would be nauseated to see me harboring a lowly grunt. You are just a stain. Jasmine lunged forward and snatched the ticket from the wood with ravenous, wide eyes, clutching it to her chest like a golden lottery ticket. Great Richard, let's invite Aunt Beatrice. She knows how to behave with the elite, not like this impoverished grunt. She was already pulling out her phone to make the call, her diamond-encrusted fingers flying across the screen. My father nodded slowly, lifting his chin at me with a look of absolute cold finality. He pointed his finger toward the front door like a judge passing a death sentence. Beatrice will take your place. From this moment on, your name is struck from the Blackwell family. Get out of my house. When your 60 grand salary gets cut, don't come crawling back. My mother leaned back in her chair and smirked from her seat, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. She held the glass up toward me with a look of theatrical pity, the red wine catching the chandelier light like liquid blood. Ungrateful failure, she spat, taking a sip. Go and embrace your raggedy military ideals. They were actively publicly stripping me of my ticket, handing it to a vain, empty-headed socialite, and permanently erasing me from the family tree. They thought this brutal, calculated punishment would make me collapse in tears, drop to my knees, and beg for their forgiveness. But in the eyes of a hardened soldier sworn to protect the nation from actual threats, this was not a punishment at all. This was profound liberation. My pulse remained a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute. I didn't break eye contact with my father, absorbing his hatred without absorbing his poison. I looked at each of them, one by one, slowly, deliberately. My father rigid with contempt, my brother drunk on power and scotch, Jasmine clutching a stolen ticket like a trophy she would hang on her wall, my mother sipping wine over the corpse of her own daughter's dignity. I catalogued their faces, not as family, as targets on a tactical board. I slowly stood up, intentionally letting the heavy wooden legs of my chair scrape harshly against the polished hardwood floor, the screeching sound cutting through their arrogant silence like a blade. You are making a permanent decision. I warned them coldly, my voice ringing out through the dining room like forged steel without a single tremor of fear. You are igniting a war of life and death, and you will regret casting me out. Without shedding a single tear, without showing a fraction of an inch of weakness, I sharply adjusted my posture to perfect military attention. I executed a flawless crisp about-face, the heels of my boots clicking together with a sharp crack, and marched out of the dining room with the towering, untouchable pride of a commanding officer leaving a conquered enemy territory. The sound of my boots on the hardwood echoed through the mansion like a countdown. As I moved purposefully down the long hallway toward the front foyer to leave the clinking of heavy crystal glasses, and the obnoxious, triumphant laughter of my family echoed loudly from the dining room behind me. They were celebrating their perceived triumph, pouring another round of Scotch toasting to the removal of the family stain. They genuinely thought kicking me out into the cold was a monumental victory that secured their criminal future. But they were entirely too arrogant to realize a fundamental baseline military rule. Never turn your back on an adversary while they are still roaming freely inside your base of operations. To grab my heavy winter coat, I had to pass directly through the expansive living room. Sitting wide open on the expensive glass coffee table was Bradley's primary work laptop. The high-resolution screen was still glowing brightly in the dim room, illuminating the surrounding leather furniture with a pale blue haze. He had just been actively browsing the classified Project Sentinel files and was so consumed by his own massive ego that he hadn't bothered to lock his machine or close the lid. His half-finished whiskey sat next to it, leaving a wet ring on a $100,000 table. His blind confidence was his fatal flaw, and tonight it would cost him everything. Without slowing my pace from the concealed inner lining of my jacket, I extracted a device no bigger than a human fingernail, a specialized, highly classified micro-stealth drive used exclusively by top-tier electronic warfare units for rapid data extraction. I didn't break my stride. I didn't look over my shoulder to see if the maid or my mother was watching. With movements smooth, fluid, and precise down to the absolute millimeter, I gently brushed my hand along the metallic edge of the laptop as I walked past the coffee table. The device slid seamlessly into the port with a silent, barely perceptible click. It immediately executed a devastating zero-day attack, puncturing every single expensive civilian firewall the arrogant lawyer had installed in a matter of milliseconds. His entire digital fortress crumbled silently, and he was 3 rooms away laughing about my $60,000 salary. The custom military-grade script ruthlessly cloned all his sensitive data-encrypted emails, stolen source code, and offshore bank account ledgers, cloning them directly into the device's hyperdense microstorage without leaving a single trace on the machine. I counted the seconds methodically in my head, controlling my breathing to maintain a completely natural walking pace across the room. 1, 2, 3. My boots didn't speed up. My shoulders didn't tense. I looked exactly like a disowned daughter sadly collecting her coat. Exactly 12 seconds later, the progress indicator on my smartwatch flashed green. Complete. I extracted the tiny device with the masterful, invisible swipe of a trained intelligence operative, immediately slipped on my heavy winter coat, and walked calmly out of the mansion. I closed their massive front door completely untouched, vanishing into the night like a ghost. They never heard a sound. The biting, freezing cold hit my face like a physical blow as I stepped into my reinforced military sedan parked discreetly on the dark street. I pressed the engine ignition button and the V8 engine purred to life. The secure tactical display on the dashboard blinked a solid green, confirming the massive, highly incriminating data packet was safely locked deep within the drive. My family thought they had just tossed out a pathetic, helpless failure onto the streets, but in reality, they had just hand-delivered the exact, undeniable blueprints of their massive federal crimes directly to the most bloodthirsty, relentless hunter on the grid. I shifted the heavy gear selector into drive, a freezing, terrifying smile crossing my face, and accelerated smoothly into the dark Washington night. The Georgetown mansion grew smaller in my rearview mirror. The warm golden light from their dining room window faded into the dark trees lining the street. Somewhere inside those walls, they were still laughing, still pouring scotch, still celebrating the exile of their weakest member. They had no idea that the weakest member had just robbed them blind in 12 seconds flat. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth seeing anymore. Midnight hit the digital clocks. Deep inside the heavily fortified underground bunker of the Pentagon, the air was freezing cold and thick with the metallic smell of heavy server machinery and electrical ozone. I sat alone before the massive multi-screen command console of the Cyber Command Center, rapidly punching in my biometric authentication codes. The fluorescent strips above hummed faintly. The only warmth in the room came from the processors running at full capacity. Our advanced military system tore through Bradley's stolen laptop data at blinding speed, ripping apart his pitiful civilian encryption like wet tissue paper. Initially, I expected to find standard boring corporate bribery and offshore money laundering trails, the kind of white-collar greed that Washington quietly digests every fiscal quarter. But as a heavily encrypted, deeply buried ghost folder was violently cracked open, the blood in my veins turned to absolute freezing ice. A massive data stream linked directly to the Foreign Intelligence Syndicate, a highly hostile, heavily armed foreign espionage alliance that had been on our classified threat board for over a decade. I ripped open the source files, my eyes scanning the dense lines of code flashing across the monitors. This was not simple bribery or greed. My family had secretly, methodically sold the core classified source code of Project Sentinel to the enemy, and they had actively embedded a devastating logic bomb inside the architecture. If this compromised communication system went live across the United States military, the logic bomb would activate, creating a catastrophic 14-minute blind spot in our entire global missile defense radar network. 14 minutes. More than enough time for a hostile enemy nation to wipe our primary military bases off the map without a single warning siren ever sounding. 14 minutes to turn American soil into a graveyard. The initial shock instantly mutated into a blinding maximum velocity rage that shook my core. I pressed my palms flat against the cold steel console and forced 3 slow, controlled breaths through my teeth. My father and my brother were perfectly willing to sell the lives of tens of thousands of innocent service members and hand over the nation's security just to comfortably pocket a few $100 million. Their relentless mockery of my uniform was just a shallow, pathetic cover for their absolute, bottomless corruption. They called me a freeloader while they sold the nation's shield to the highest foreign bidder. This was no longer a petty dramatic family dispute over an inheritance or a dinner invitation. This was undeniable apocalyptic high treason. I slammed my fist onto the steel console, immediately bypassing all standard chains of command, and established a direct priority red alert secure video line. The stern, battle-hardened face of Admiral Harrison, my supreme commander, filled the central high-definition screen. His eyes were sharp even at this hour. Behind him, the flag of the United States Navy hung on the wall of his private quarters. Sir, detecting an existential threat-level security breach directly related to Project Sentinel and hostile foreign espionage. I reported, my voice laced with lethal intent radiating from every single syllable. The traitors are the Blackwell Company, requesting immediate authorization to deploy a special tactical roundup operation. Admiral Harrison did not hesitate. He did not ask me to repeat myself. He did not question the source. He gave a firm, hard nod, the deep respect for his top intelligence officer evident in his sharp eyes. Authorization granted, Lieutenant Colonel. Prepare the net. I terminated the connection with a sharp keystroke, my fingers resting heavily on the console, my eyes locked on the monitors, completely ready to go to war against the people who gave me life and then tried to take it away. If you are as outraged by this sickening treason as I was, hit that like button right now and type justice in the comments. The trap I was about to set would ensure they never saw the sun again. The following days were an exhausting, dark arms race conducted entirely in the shadows. I mobilized the full, terrifying force of the FBI and heavily armed federal agents for an unprecedented, airtight dragnet. I slept in 2-hour shifts on the concrete floor of the command center, running on black coffee and cold fury. Digging deeper and deeper into the darkest corners of Bradley's cloned hard drive, I unearthed a hidden video file shot secretly in a Macau hotel room. I hit play, leaning closer to the monitors. In the grainy, low-light footage, my father and Bradley were raising champagne glasses with known foreign operatives. Their faces were relaxed, smiling, comfortable. A spy across the table leaned in, his voice trembling slightly. What about the risk of federal exposure? If the Pentagon traces this back to you, we are all dead. My father answered casually, swirling his drink with the ease of a man discussing weekend golf plans. We have a sacrificial pawn. My daughter Alex. She works at the Pentagon. We used her accounts to create the pipeline. If the government finds out, all the evidence will point straight to her. She will go to a court-martial and eat a bullet instead of us. Bradley sat right next to him in that chilling video, laughing uproariously, slamming his palm on the table in amusement, openly praising the flawless, murderous plan to frame his own sister. The spy across the table nodded approvingly, and they all raised their glasses in a toast. To my death. To my execution. To throwing my body into the fire so they could walk away clean and rich. I stopped the playback. I placed both palms flat on the console and closed my eyes. 3 breaths. Slow. Controlled. Measured. When I opened my eyes, every single trace of human emotion inside my chest had completely calcified into impenetrable stone. They were not just casually selling out the country for a massive payday. They were actively going to use my blood to wash their hands clean, shoving me violently to a military firing squad so they could safely enjoy their blood money in a penthouse suite. The very last microscopic thread of biological connection snapped instantly and forever. I was not dealing with a toxic family anymore. I was dealing with enemy combatants who had actively, gleefully plotted my gruesome death. The face of my father on that screen, smiling while he signed my death warrant, would stay burned into my retinas for the rest of my life. But it would not weaken me. It was fuel. Pure, refined, weapons-grade fuel for the furnace I was about to ignite underneath their entire empire. I stood rigidly before the massive digital tactical map in the Pentagon Situation Room, Admiral Harrison, standing firmly by my side, reviewing the deployment logistics. Pins marked every asset, every exit, every sightline. We can arrest them right now at their private residence in Georgetown, he suggested softly, offering me a quick, quiet resolution, a clean extraction. Minimal collateral. Standard procedure. I slowly shook my head, my eyes as sharp and cold as a straight razor. No, they love putting on a grand show. They desperately want to be honored at the White House State Dinner, so we will give them that exact magnificent stage. I picked up a thick red marker and traced a massive circle on the architectural blueprint of the White House banquet hall. I want to violently shatter their entire arrogant existence right in front of the Washington political elite. I commanded coldly, my voice echoing off the concrete walls of the Situation Room. We will turn the banquet hall into a slaughterhouse. The Admiral smiled with deep professional approval, the kind of smile a warrior gives when he recognizes a perfect tactical kill order. As you wish, Lieutenant Colonel. We will act. The most elite, battle-hardened FBI tactical units were immediately ordered to go deep undercover, dressing in tuxedos as high society guests and wait staff. Secret Service and federal agents were positioned at every entrance, every exit, every service tunnel beneath the building. The inescapable trap had been painstakingly woven with steel wire, and the greedy, arrogant wolves were smiling blindly as they prepared to walk right into the kill zone on the night of the state dinner. Returning to the exact present moment, standing frozen at the north gate of the White House, the Blackwell family looked like they had been violently struck by lightning, witnessing Admiral Harrison and the heavily armed security forces salute me with absolute, unwavering reverence. "Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel." The Admiral repeated, his voice carrying over the wind loud enough for every single member of my family to hear. This impossible truth was far too brutal for my father's fragile, elitist brain to process. His arrogant, permanent smirk died instantly, completely replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared at the red military ID in my hand. Aunt Beatrice frantically clutched the gold-plated VIP ticket to her chest, her jaw dropping completely open in shock, her expensive pearls swaying as her whole body trembled. Jasmine panicked, darting her eyes wildly at my commanding, terrifying presence, while Bradley physically stumbled backward away from me, sweating profusely as if he were suddenly standing in a blazing oven. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. As I prepared to walk down the pristine red carpet toward the entrance, Bradley suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed trance. The exact same vicious man who had aggressively kicked me out of his house, threatened to destroy my career, and toasted champagne to my planned execution, now cowardly reached his trembling hand out toward the armed guards, desperate to leech off my immense power. "Wait. We are her family. We are with Lieutenant Colonel Alex." He yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. His silk tie was crooked. His hands were shaking. The composure of the senior law partner was completely gone. I stopped dead in my tracks on the red carpet. My sharp, unforgiving gaze swept over them like a military targeting laser, locking onto a threat. I was no longer the pathetic daughter they routinely berated and humiliated. I was no longer the grunt they mocked over roasted pheasant and expensive scotch. I was their absolute, undeniable commander. And commanders do not negotiate with parasites. "I do not know these people." My voice rang out, freezing the air around us with absolute zero detachment. "But let them through security. They have tickets to the execution." The elite Secret Service agents complied, immediately stepping aside. My father was left hyperventilating on the pavement, clutching his ticket like a life raft, while Bradley stood frozen, his brain completely short-circuiting. I didn't give them a single second glance. I marched proudly inside the gates, my boots clicking on the pavement with the steady rhythm of a war drum, leaving them trembling in my wake, while the massive, heavy oak doors to the inner sanctum of the White House opened exclusively for me. A grueling hour later, the Blackwell family had nervously shuffled into the grand banquet hall. Even terrified, their parasitic nature flared up. Jasmine desperately tried to act upper class, smoothing her wrinkled dress and forcing a plastic smile. She leaned over to my mother, her voice trembling. "The guards outside just made a mistake, Catherine. That's all. We belong here." My father aggressively rushed forward, attempting to shake hands with the White House Chief of Staff to salvage his damaged public image. But the Chief of Staff coldly stepped back, looking at my father with intense, visible disgust, as if he were staring at literal trash on his shoe. He ignored my father completely, leaving his hand hanging in empty air, stepped up to the massive podium and tapped the microphone, commanding absolute silence from the room. The chandelier lights dimmed. Every conversation died. Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed across the completely silent, glittering room. Tonight we face unprecedented security challenges. Therefore, instead of announcing standard contracts, the President has decided to honor an extraordinary officer, the one holding the entire digital defense system of the United States. Please welcome the Commander of Special Operations Cyber Command. A blinding, brilliant spotlight hit the main double doors. I stepped out into the light. I was not wearing a cheap, off-the-rack civilian suit, nor a frivolous, sparkling evening gown. I was draped in my immaculate, perfectly pressed military dress blue uniform. The silver oak leaf insignia of a lieutenant colonel gleamed fiercely on my shoulders, and my chest was covered in heavy combat medals, each one earned in operations they would never know about. My boots were polished to a mirror finish. My posture was absolute. The daughter they threw in the garbage was standing at the front of the most powerful room in the Western Hemisphere. The entire banquet room erupted in thunderous, deafening applause, but the Blackwell VIP table was struck with instant rigor mortis. My father's face went paper white, and his delicate crystal wine glass slipped right from his trembling fingers, shattering into 100 pieces on the marble floor. The sound of it breaking cut through the applause like a scream. Bradley collapsed heavily into his chair, gripping his head with both hands and groaning in absolute mind-breaking horror. God, it wasn't a mistake. She really commands the entire grid. Jasmine and my mother trembled violently, their eyes completely vacant with raw, paralyzing terror. The daughter they mocked, evicted, and planned to brutally sacrifice to a firing squad was a legendary military hero standing at the absolute pinnacle of federal power. Under the brilliant lights, I looked down at their terror and gave them a cold executioner's smile. Greetings. Project Sentinel was supposed to be a monumental leap. My voice echoed through the massive speakers with terrifying, absolute authority. But it was twisted into a weapon to stab this nation in the back. I pressed a small remote button in my hand. The massive presentation screens behind me illuminated with their treasonous source code the offshore transfers, and the damning video of my father and Bradley negotiating with foreign spies in that Macau hotel room. The crowd gasped in shock. The admirals and generals stood up in furious, explosive outrage, their chairs scraping back across the marble. A 3-star general at the front table slammed his fist down and pointed directly at the Blackwell table. Senators gripped the edges of their seats. The Secretary of Defense locked eyes with Admiral Harrison and gave a single, sharp nod of authorization. The Blackwell Company didn't just bribe, they committed treason, and they planned to throw me to a court-martial as a sacrificial lamb. As the Commander of Cyber Command, I officially terminate all Sentinel contracts. I turned sharply to Admiral Harrison, clicked my polished heels together, and delivered a razor-sharp, flawless military salute. Sir, the evidence is complete. The rest falls under your jurisdiction. The Admiral returned the salute with a hard, proud look, then roared at the top of his lungs, "Federal agents! Arrest all of them for high treason." Instantly, dozens of guests all around the room ripped away their civilian suits to reveal heavy FBI and federal agent tactical gear underneath. They charged the Blackwell table from every direction. Bradley wailed pathetically, tackled face first into the royal carpet. Before he could take a single step toward the exit, his arms violently wrenched behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. His gold watch cracked against the marble floor. His silk shirt tore at the shoulder. Jasmine shrieked like a total maniac as a stern IRS agent flashed a badge right in her face. Jasmine Blackwell, all your domestic and offshore assets are frozen effective immediately. You own absolutely nothing. She was dragged out, kicking and screaming like a feral animal, her designer heels scraping across the polished floor. My mother completely lost her mind, thrashing against the guards. "Alex, tell them to stop. I am your mother," she shrieked, but they hauled her away without an ounce of mercy. The woman who called me a disgrace to the bloodline could not stop screaming the name of the only person who might save her. My father violently thrashed against the agents, crawling on his hands and knees to the base of my podium. Snot and tears smeared across his pathetic face as he begged like a coward. "Alex, please save me, we are blood." I leaned down, my eyes piercing through the fame-obsessed traitor like a sword. "You mocked my uniform for being cheap. Let's see how much your federal prison jumpsuit costs. Take him away." Their desperate, animalistic screaming faded slowly behind the heavy oak doors, completely swallowed by the relentless halls of federal justice. The toxic, rotting cancer had been violently, surgically excised from my life forever. 6 months later, the Washington sky was crystal clear. The national security grid had been completely purged of their infected code. My father was sentenced to federal death row for high treason. Bradley was rotting away in a maximum security cell with a life sentence and no possibility of parole. Jasmine was serving a miserable 10-year stretch for conspiracy, and my mother was last seen leaving a county courthouse alone, stripped of every asset, every connection, every shred of the status she once worshipped. The Blackwell Mansion in Georgetown was seized by the federal government and converted into a Veterans Resource Center. The oil painting of my grandfather that once hid my father's secret safe now hung in the lobby right above a brass plaque that read, "Donated in the name of true service." I signed the transfer paperwork myself. The crystal chandelier that lit their empire of greed now hung over a room where wounded soldiers learned to walk again. I stood peacefully on the Truman balcony of the White House, wearing my comfortable combat fatigues, proudly clinking glasses of bourbon with Admiral Harrison. The cool, refreshing wind whipped freely through my hair. I had successfully, ruthlessly eradicated the seeds of treason from my own family tree, completely shedding a highly toxic past to stand firmly at the peak of glory as an elite soldier fiercely protecting the peace of tens of thousands of lives. Absolute truth had prevailed, and their unbridled arrogance had paid the ultimate bloody price. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If you felt the satisfaction of this well-deserved karma, please leave a like and share your thoughts below. I will see you in the next story.